Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the William Bonney podcast. Today I thought I'd talk about some of the people I was in prison with, because it was the people that really made it one way or the other for me. Prison is what it is. It's a bunch of very high walls containing some wings with hundreds of people on them who don't want to be there. Prison can be a pretty poor experience, and it was some of the lowest times of my life. But it was also, perversely, some of the best experiences of my life, and some of the best memories I have of my life, weirdly, are in prison. And prison is what it is, like I said. So it's just the people people in there who either make it for you or don't. So today I thought I'd talk about good and bad, some of the people that I remember from my 10-year experience in prison. So the first guy I was going to talk about was possibly one of my first best mates in prison, and his name was Kevin. He was a Jamaican, massive lad. He was about 6'6", immensely strong. I've noticed this about a lot of black people in prison, is they're just, a lot of them are natural athletes. And the minute they start lifting weights and things, they just start growing, and they've got muscle definition, and they've got a fantastic physique. It's just something about, Africans and Jamaicans that make them very good at sports. I don't think this is groundbreaking. So, black people generally are good at sports. This guy was massive, and I used to train with him quite a lot. And I don't know why he took to me, but he did. Maybe he saw me as a bit of a charity case, and maybe he could see me drowning, and he was just one of those good guys who liked to help people out. He was one of my first good friends in Portland, and he was one of the people that helped me get my confidence, which I was then able to use to help stand up for myself, but also make it a slightly better experience in prison. Now, me and Kev would talk about, we'd go down to the association rooms and we'd watch films and TV and stuff on Saturdays and things, and sometimes it would just be me and him sat there. There's all sorts of chaos going on, and a lot of people are just playing pool and they're not even watching telly and stuff, and there'd be all sorts of chaos, but me and him would just be sat there with chairs next to each other, sort of half watching the telly, half kind of just talking to each other about our families and friends. And he would tell me about all these caves in Jamaica. Obviously I live on the coast in Cornwall, so caves and beaches and things aren't unfamiliar to me, but he'd be talking about caves that you'd go in and you'd be, go down them for like miles. These kind of, he's talking more about sort of not potholing, but caves you can walk into for miles and miles, and you need to take almost like a Molotov cocktail in there as like a rudimentary torch, so you can light your way for the trip back out. And he'd say to me that sometimes these torches went out, so you'd be stuck in this cave, like a mile underground with no light. And he'd tell me about bats and things that he'd find down there and stuff. And it's obviously that's nothing like the experiences we have in Cornwall. You go in a cave and it's about 10 meters back and it stops. But he would tell me about some of the experiences of the community he grew up in, and how he was because he used to run drugs from Jamaica to the UK, and he had a place in New York and he had a place in Jamaica, so he was quite well off. And when he was in Jamaica, he lived in quite a poor area, and he was one of those blokes that would help all the kids out. So he would buy them backpacks and stuff and school books and shit like this. And he was a really good guy. And I kept his address after we left. And it broke me that, in the process of sort of moving and changing around and things and coming in and out of prison, I lost that address, and I never actually did get in contact with him. Now, I've tried finding him a few times on Facebook, but his name isn't massively uncommon, and God knows where in the world he is now, if he's still alive. That's always the sad thing about people like me and like him, is that unfortunately, if you go down the wrong path and continue to go down the wrong path, you may not end up living all that long. So yeah, Kevin Reed, if you're out there anywhere, and you just happen to be listening to it, or you know Kevin Reed in Jamaica, then pass him the link. Let him know I'm thinking about him. So the next bunch of lunatics I want to talk about were the guys that made prison possibly some of the best times of my life for me. It was down on the resettlement wing in Dartmoor. and it was coming off the back of I just basically been out and come back in again straight away. Within one day, I was back in prison. So I was looking at another parole sentence and working in the carpentry shop. And one of the pals, because I've been in and out so often now, I was starting to become a bit of a regular face. So some of the lads, I started to become friendly with some of the boys in there. And one of them went down to the resettlement wing. I noticed one of the people I was starting to become a bit friendly with went down to the resettlement wing, and he opened up that opportunity for me to go down there. And once I got down there, then I met a whole bunch of other crazy Cornish hooligans who are some of the best lads I've ever met, and I'm still good friends with a whole bunch of them now. And weirdly, when I started making these videos, I was talking about the resettlement wing and some of my experiences, and I started noticing this guy in the comments, and he was saying, "Oh, I was in prison then, and I was on the resettlement wing then as well around the same time." And it turns out, we were actually pals, and we was on the wing together. So as anonymous as I make these videos, it still found its way back to me, and a couple of my friends have found these videos from that wing, and I've been listening. So hello, if you're listening again, boys. But yeah, that wing was crazy because essentially we were stuck on it for a year or 18 months, working towards getting out. You can't mix with the rest of the prison, so essentially it's like just being in a dorm. You're around all your pals all the time. You've got to do a bit of studying and a bit of working towards your release. But the rest of the time, you're either sitting in each other's cells, drinking coffee, talking, playing Xbox, or it was PlayStations back then, or just training, fucking about, playing pool, table tennis. We were just some of the best pals there. There was a little gang of Cornish lads in there, so you know who you are. And that was some of the best experiences I've ever had. Now, I've talked at length, about some of the crazy stuff we got up to in my resettlement videos and other videos, my diary podcast and stuff. So, if you want to hear some of the stories of what we got up to on the resettlement wing, then by all means go back and listen to some of our other videos. But it was just, like I say, a crazy time. On the wing, we were just doing all sorts of shit. It was the same time that like Jackass and Dirty Sanchez were quite big. So we found ourselves, bored on the wing, just doing like Jackass stunts, whipping each other with belts and stuff, and just eating fucking handfuls of salt and spinning each other around on chairs. And I know it sounds stupid, but it's, like I say, it's that kind of university bonding experience that we had. Not to say that that wing's soft. It was just, when I first went down there, it was full of a load of Bristol knobheads. I'm sorry if you're from Bristol. These people were knobheads and from Bristol. But there was more of them than there was anybody else. So they were in charge of things. And there was a couple of little bully boys and stuff. And there were some Welsh lads on the wing actually as well. I wasn't going to mention this, but there's a guy, I forgot to mention him. He was called Darren, and he was another one of my best pals actually. And when I went down onto the wing, he was already there, and we ended up getting close. And I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he got kicked off the wing or if he ended up just going home again. Because so many people got kicked off that wing, because it was very difficult to keep your head above the rules, especially for a lot of criminals who are used to breaking every rule, used to breaking every bit of trust given to them. It was a lot to handle down there because you were told what to do quite a lot. You'd have to, I'm making it sound like it's a holiday camp, but you'd have to get up, you'd have to clean. Everyone had a cleaning job in the morning. So some days your job would be to mop the entire landing, between one or two of you. And a lot of inmates don't want to do that. They don't want to get out of bed, be told you've got to go up and mop or sweep. And, they just crash and burn within a few weeks. But, this lad, Darren, he was a good lad. He was from Wales. And, he's another one I've tried looking up on Facebook. But I couldn't find him. Now, it wasn't all good times and best mates and things. So I'm going to go back to Portland now. And one of the lads I was in Portland with I always call him the crazy Kosovan, because he was a bit of a lunatic. He had one of those big eagles tattooed on his chest. Now, when I'm saying like big eagle, it's like one of those ones you see on the top of the Roman staffs and stuff. It's a military kind of eagle. And he was from He was from that sort of Kosovo, Yugoslavia kind of region, and he was a soldier. And he told me this story about when he was a kid, he got kicked out of school because he'd taken a hand grenade into school. And I kind of looked at him in kind of shock, and I was like, "Where the fuck did you get a hand grenade from?" And he kind of just looked back at me and was just shrugged and was like, "Where else?" I didn't really continue the conversation much further, but he was an odd character. He was in the cell opposite me once I got up onto the Fours landing in Portland, and he was a great guy, very likable, very excitable, but he was very serious as well. You could tell he'd seen some shit, and when him and this other Kosovan used to get together, they would talk and they would laugh at us, as in sort of Europeans and people from England, because they would say that we'd been brought up on cake and cheese, whereas they'd probably had it quite hard and quite rough, and especially with the war in Ukraine and things, it kind of brings it home, like war in Europe and people that are very similarly aligned culturally to us. Suddenly there's a war, on our doorstep, and he'd been through that, and then he'd come the few hundred miles. He'd spent a lot of time in Italy. He told me about how he used to live in a brothel in Italy, and he used to protect some of the girls there. And then he'd moved over from Italy over to the UK. He'd ended up stabbing an Iraqi in an argument and killed him. And weirdly enough, he taught me, because people always say about prison being a university, and you come out being a much better criminal than you went in, and it's very true. He gave me tips on how to clean a knife so it's forensically sound, so that if you did ever do anything like that, then you can get away with it. And he taught me how to do that. And I've never used that technique, but I know it. It's in the back of my memory if I need to. But yeah, he was a cool guy, but again, slightly odd. He used to give me books. He was quite religious, so he would give me either interesting books, or he'd give me books based on religion or theology and things like this. And I was not interested. At that point, I was just reading autobiographies of footballers and things like this. It was, I'd always enjoyed reading, but I wasn't a deep thinker or a deep reader at that point. And bearing in mind I'm 19, I'm more interested in nuts magazines than I am, fucking theology. But he's another one that I'm fairly sure that if he's not out causing trouble somewhere, he's probably 6 feet under. Now I've mentioned again in one of my other podcasts, or probably my diary podcasts, about some of the scary guys that you're around in prison. And scary can be relative. Obviously, it's a bit like a horror film. The bits that make you nervous or scared in a horror film aren't the gory bits or the the people getting their head smashed in. It's the anticipation of violence or the anticipation of the scariness that's about to happen. So I always remember this dude, and he's got one eye. And people have mentioned, is it Marvin Herbert? And I for some reason I thought his name was Marvin, but it's not. It's not Marvin Herbert, the guy from YouTube with a lot to say. It was this other dude, and I'm sure he's from the southwest. He's from like Exeter or Bristol or some shit. And he's only got one eye. And I remember one day there'd been an altercation over a phone. There was, when you're hearing on the sort of prison grapevine that someone's been given a phone to look after, and then suddenly he hasn't been able to give the phone back, and there's all sorts of excuses why he hasn't been able to give the phone back. One of the rumours I heard is that it's gone into his ass. He's put it into his ass, and it's gone too far up, and he can't get it back. And that's what he's saying, and that's what that's the rumour going around that I've heard he's saying. Now, obviously, people in prison, they're quite hardened to these excuses. Now, I remember a saying from a film. I think it's in Lock, Stock. Never underestimate the predictability of stupidity. And what I mean by that is, in prison, people will burn the bridges they're standing on. They will borrow drugs or money, and then have no intention of paying it back. Now that's maybe an unwise thing to do on the outside of prison, because someone's going to be coming after you. But inside prison, it's bordering on suicidal, because you can't get anywhere. You can't run away. You're literally tied into these fucking wings, and you're trapped inside these walls with these people. But people still do it. So this guy borrowed a phone, and for whatever reason he hasn't given it back. So now this one-eyed guy is after him. And one day on the wing, I'm gym orderly, so we're collecting all these people for gym, and I'm waiting down by the door to take us off the wing and go over to the gym. There's a whole crowd of us just kind of milling around, bits and pieces are going on, and the guy with one eye kind of turns up in front of me, and I'm just sort of stood there looking at him, and he looks tense. He looks like he's about to kick off, and the whole situation is kind of bizarre because there's just normality going on everywhere, and then suddenly within the crowd, this guy's not communicating with anyone. He's not dealing with anyone. He's got fucking one eye. The other eye's looking all weird and grey, and he's stood there and he's tense and he's angry. And I look at his arms, and I'm starting to take in more of the situation. And I look at his arms, and he's holding his gym bag over his shoulder like a swag bag, or like you see Santa stood there, and he's got blood speckled all over his forearms. Some little bits and some big bits. There's a couple of big drips of blood that are starting to just run down his forearm a little bit. You look at his t-shirt, and it's it's kind of pulled a little bit, like he's been in a scuffle. And again, there's small specks of blood and fucking saliva or whatever the fuck it is on his in his t-shirt. So you can tell that this guy's just had quite a violent encounter, within the last few minutes, and he's stood there still raging inside. He's still going 100 miles an hour. You can see him. He's almost shaking. He wasn't a massive guy. He wasn't, really muscle bound. But he had a physique about him, and he was one of those kind of skinny guys. Not skinny, but he was one of those kind of like normal looking dark guys. But you could tell he was quite tough. And again, that weird one-eyed grey dead fucking eyeball in his head just made it look even weirder. And people have commented before that why was that a scary situation? And it's again the only thing I can explain about it is it's like being in a horror movie where the gore isn't the scary bit, it's the anticipation of it, and I'm within feet now of someone who's just half beaten someone to death, and now he's standing right next to me. And the staff have no idea, other inmates have no idea. He's that psychopath standing amongst you, and that's a very scary situation when you're not safe. That other guy, is in exactly the same situation as you. The guy who's lost the phone is just as protected by the staff, just as protected by the cameras as everybody else, and he's just got his ass handed to him. And now he's standing there in front of you. And it is a scary situation, and that's one of the situations I always remember. And nothing happened, nothing kicked off. Everyone went about their day, but just being within the proximity of someone who's that violent and getting away with it is a very scary situation, and a very real one that I'll never forget. Now, as you go in and out of prison, you meet some lifers that are in there, and you get to meet a bunch of lifers who are at different stages of their sentences, but also they've got whole different philosophies about them. So there's kind of three lifers that I think of when I think of my time in prison. The first guy was a guy I met in Exeter. He'd got about a 20-year tariff, something like this. I never actually asked him what he was in for. He was just such a nice guy, we never even talked about it. But I knew he was in for life, and I knew he was doing roughly 20 years. He was a short guy. He looked like Lewis Hamilton's dad. And that's how I used to take the piss out of him. I'd be, we'd be going to the gym or something, and I'd say, I'd seen your boy racing. He's doing well, He'd just have a little joke and a snigger. But he was strong. He was a very strong guy. He loved his gym. But he was just one of the nicest guys I'd ever met. And it always amazes me, like, he wouldn't have been out of place if I'd met him, but standing by the touchlines on a Saturday afternoon just watching some local football, or if I'd been at some sort of talk at a work event, and he'd been stood next to me or sat next to me, and we were just chatting. If he was from another branch, and he just seemed like the most normal dude. But he was, in for life, and obviously in for quite bad crime. And but in prison, he was just a good guy. Now, opposed, on the other side of this, I remember seeing a lifer that was in the first few years of his sentence, and he was trying to appeal it, and he'd killed his wife. And I remember hearing him because he was in Exeter because he was back down because he was going for his appeal and going to court and stuff. So he was back in the locality so he could get his appeal. And I remember because he was a local lad, he'd hit the news and stuff. And I remember reading, because I'd heard all his stories about how he hadn't done it, and I'd heard his side of it, and how he was worried about his wife had gone missing and she hadn't come back for a few days and blah blah blah. And then suddenly she turns up in the woods, and then suddenly he gets arrested and he couldn't understand why, and blah blah blah. And I'd heard all of his story and he sounded quite convincing. And then when you read it in the local paper, when it all comes out in the local rag again, and you hear a completely different story. You hear the witnesses saying that they were in the house arguing, and there was banging and crashing, and then suddenly she went quiet, and then she went missing, and then he came back, covered in mud and blood, and was being weird in the garden, and the reality of the situation is nothing like the story he was telling me. So, people lie in prison. You've got to work out quickly who's telling the truth and who's not. And you get to be weirdly, you get to be a really good judge of character just from having to deal with the people in prison. People will always be shitbags, but it's up to you to see them coming. The third lifer that I always think about is a chap I met in Dartmoor, and he'd been in for God knows how many years, more than 10, between 10 and 15 years he'd been in. I think he knew he was never getting out. And I've spoken about him before a little bit when we're talking about kind of the mental institutions and stuff, because he was one of the lifers who told me that he basically went to Broadmoor as a kind of holiday. He got himself sectioned and then went up there for the drugs, basically, because they give you what they call a liquid cosh if you kick off or you're acting up. It just gives you these drugs that make you into a stupefied, dopey inmate, basically, who just sits in the chair in the day room and dribbles and doesn't do anything. So, yeah, he told me about how he spent quite proudly, 3 or 4 years just going around Broadmoor, acting mental, getting the drugs, just spending a bit of a break. He told me some of the crazy stories about the inmates that got up there. God, some of the stuff that goes on in Broadmoor must be insane. Weirdly, my uncle's in there now, actually. He's one of the lifers I don't really think about. I've done episodes about my uncle, and so listen back if you want to catch up. But he's doing 19 years for murder at the moment, and I went to track him and found he was in Broadmoor. He must have been sectioned. He's at a time in his sentence where he should be working towards getting out now, and he's in Broadmoor, so it doesn't look positive for him. So yeah. I just wanted to talk quickly about, I know I haven't gone into massive detail, but I just wanted to talk quickly about some of the characters I was in prison with. We've talked about some of the good times, so I always like to balance that out with some of the bad times. So let's think back to Portland again and some of the times when I was really struggling. So let's talk about my bully. His name was Fitzpatrick. He was a tall black guy, skinny. There's nothing about him. Absolutely nothing about him, but he was a bully, and he saw weakness in me, and he exploited that. And I still think about him to this day. Not every day. I'm not like waking up thinking I'm going to get him or anything, but I know his face. I know his name. If I ever see him on holiday, he's getting drowned. I'll knock his ice creams right out of his hand. He made my life very, very difficult. But he helped make me who I am today. So, I'm not the tough, resilient guy, that I am in the workplace now, if it wasn't for meeting people like him. Bad people and good people. They've all brought me to this point of sitting here recording this for you today. So life is unexpected and colourful, and the good and the bad, they all help us get to who we are today. So let's raise a drink, remember the good ones, the bad ones, and the ones who didn't make it. Thank Thank you very much for listening. Let's talk again soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.